Well, good morning. Today we're going to be returning now to our sermon series on Exodus. So this is what we were working our way through before Advent and Christmas. But as we often do at that time of year, we take a break from our sermon series to reflect on the coming of Christ at Christmas. And so now we're getting back to this Old Testament story that is the story about the God who saves. And so we're going to be looking this morning at the first few verses of chapter 17, which is on page 59 in the Pew Bibles. But as we turn there, I realize that a lot of us might not really remember what's going on in the story at this point. If you watch any TV shows that are serialized, right? So it tells kind of one big story week after week. Then you know that almost every new episode sort of starts with this like previously on. At the beginning of it. And so Liz and Finn and I have been watching Skeleton Crew on Disney Plus, which is this new like Star Wars show about these kids who kind of go off on this adventure. And with streaming, you kind of don't have to do this. Like usually they're just all there at once. But Skeleton Crew is coming out week after week. And so we have to wait every Wednesday for a new episode. And so over the week, you kind of forget, like, what did happen? And so it begins with this previously on Skeleton Crew, and then you sort of see a recap. And so that's kind of what I'm going to do for a little bit this morning. The last time that we read from Exodus was at the end of November, right? So that was 6 weeks ago. So before we jump into Exodus 17, we need a little bit of a recap. And so, previously in the book of Exodus, this is what we've seen. After this relentless series of plagues, all of these huge, epic plagues that have fallen on Egypt, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, he finally agreed to let God's people go. And so God delivered his people from slavery in Egypt. And then he brought them to the Red Sea. And there on the edge of the Red Sea, in this huge, epic, dramatic fashion, God parted the Red Sea, and his people passed through on dry ground. And meanwhile, Pharaoh, he changed his mind. He was like, wait, no, I don't want them to leave. And so he sent his armies to chase after them. But when God's people made it safely to the other side of the Red Sea, to that distant shore, God brought the waters crushing down onto the Egyptians and drowned them into the waters of the sea. And so finally, God's people, the Hebrews, they're free from Egypt. Egypt doesn't really come into the story again anymore. And so now they're going forward. After this miraculous rescue, they're making their way across a desert. And the difficulties of this new reality, they quickly begin to set in because they're in a desert. The Bible sometimes uses the word wilderness, but it is a desert. It's barren. It's hot. They didn't have any water. Their food they knew was in short supply. And so as this hunger and thirst weighed down on them, the Hebrews, God's people, they began to grumble. They grumbled against each other, and they grumbled about Moses, their leader, and they grumbled against God. And God said that in that desert, he was going to test his people. Much like the plagues that were sent on Egypt, the plagues were sent so that Pharaoh would know that the Lord is God, that the one who is calling these people, the one who says of the Hebrews, these are my people, he is the God of everything. And so all of these plagues were sent so that Pharaoh would know that the Lord is God. And so now this test that comes for the Hebrews in the desert is designed so that they would know that the Lord is their God. Not just the God of all creation, the maker of heaven and earth, but their God. Their personal God, the God who made them, the God who rescued them, the God who loves them. And as they would come to see through this period of testing, he is the God who provides for them. What we saw in chapters 15 and 16 of Exodus is that God's people, they utterly and they completely failed the tests that God gave them. But what we also saw is that the passing of the test wasn't really the point. The point was for the Israelites to know that God was with them always. Even when they failed the test, God would still give them all that they needed. We saw that above all, that the test from God was an invitation to trust the Lord. through this, God was teaching his people something about himself, that he's gracious, that he's faithful. And he invites his people to look beyond what they can see right in front of them, to look beyond their present circumstance, and instead to look to him. And by looking to him, to know that he is always with them. So that's what's been going on. That's what's happened up to this point. God has done incredible things. They've seen it happen. And then they've suffered, and they've been miserable, and they've grumbled, and God has shown up and said, I am with you, and I'm always going to provide for you. So it stands to reason that it should just be smooth sailing from this point forward, right? That the rest of the book is just the Israelites singing and going through the desert and going, yeah, God is with us. He's going to take care of us always. It doesn't quite go that way. The journey through the desert is going to be hard. And the Hebrews know that God is with them. They've experienced his mercy and his provision. He's promised to always look after them. And he said all they have to do is trust in him and look to him and obey his word. So what could possibly go wrong with that? Well, that's what we're going to look at this morning. And so please follow along as I read from Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? And so Moses cried to the Lord, what shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. And behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Please pray with me. Father in heaven, we thank you for this, your word. We thank you for this time that we have together this morning. We pray that through your word and by the power of your Holy Spirit, that you would give us ears to hear and hearts to believe your good and true promises for us. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. So, if you can remember back to 6 weeks ago, when we left off at the end of chapter 16, how much has seemed to really change? How much has changed in the story? Not much. It sort of seems like there's, in one of the Lord of the Rings movies, Sam and Frodo are just wandering through the mountains, and just every day it's just rocks. Just around them is rocks. It's a bit like that. It's just desert. They've been in the desert, and it's more desert. And it's still hot, and they are still miserable. And they were grumbling in chapter 16 when we last saw them, and at the beginning of chapter 17, they're still grumbling. In many ways, it looks like just more of the same. And yet, what we're going to look at this morning is there's a key difference in this story. There's a key difference here in this story that is different from the previous two. Now, when I was little, little, there was this segment that used to come on Sesame Street, and so I'll start by asking how international is Sesame Street? Do we all know what I'm talking about with Sesame Street? Good. And so there was this segment that would come on Sesame Street where the TV screen would split into these 4 boxes. And in each box, there was a kid who was doing some sort of activity. And then this song would come on, and it sounded kind of like a game show song. And it would go, 3 of these kids belong together. 3 of these kids are kind of the same. But one of these kids is doing his own thing. Now it's time to play our game. And so the game was to spot the difference, right? There's three kids doing something and one kid's doing something different. What is the difference? And it was usually something like three kids are like doing a hula hoop and then one kid's skipping rope. Like it wasn't hard, it was for like 4 and 5-year-olds. But it was fun. It was fun to spot the difference and go, oh, like that kid. And then, in fact, as an adult, when I spot something that seems different or out of place, like I tend to go to the phrase, one of those kids is doing his own thing. And so as we think back to Exodus 15 and 16, and we now look at chapter 17, what we need to see is that there are 3 stories here that all seem very similar. But one of these stories is not like the others. They all prominently feature the Hebrews complaining, grumbling, but there's a key difference in this story. And so if you would, look with me at verse 2. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" And so now, if you want to flip back, I'm going to read a verse from Exodus 15:25. And this is when the Hebrews are at Marah, at the place where they encountered the bitter water that the Lord made sweet. Exodus 15:25 says, "There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them." And in Exodus 16, verse 4, we read that the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven." Sorry, let me start over. "Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not." And so, first, there's something that we see that's the same. It comes up 3 times, that these are tests. All 3 stories are about testing, but what's the difference? Who's testing whom? At Marah and in the desert of sin, God is testing his people. And as we talked about when we looked at these passages, it's a test that they're meant to pass. Right? It's not a hard test. God isn't setting them up for failure. He's setting his people up to succeed, to trust him, to believe in him. But even when they don't do that, even when they fail the test is designed to assure them of God's faithful love, of his care, of his provision. But when we get to Rephidim, it's now the people who are going to test God. And the truth is, it's an impossible test, because it's a test that's rooted in grumbling. It's rooted in distrust. It's rooted in judgment. Now, recently, my son Finn and I, we had a conversation about the 2 ways that you can ask the question why. Now, there's probably more, but he and I talked about 2 ways that you can ask the question why. One is to ask out of curiosity. Right, like you can ask the question, why is the sky blue? And then you can have a whole conversation about light refraction and science-y stuff that I don't really understand, but I can say the words. Right, so when we ask why in this way, it's because we're curious, because we want to learn something. We're eager to learn something. But we can also ask why as a way of grumbling. So for example, let's say that after church one Sunday, somebody brings cupcakes to celebrate a birthday, and you give your child a cupcake. And after they've eaten it, they come back up to you and they say, "Can I have another cupcake?" And you say, "No, you've already had one, and that's plenty." And then your child looks at you and says, "But why can't I have another cupcake?" And you think, "I just told you why." That's the other kind of why. It's not really an honest question. It's not coming from a place of curiosity or a desire to learn. It's a complaint. It's a grumble. In fact, it's really a demand. It's a way of saying, "But I want another cupcake. I think I deserve another cupcake. You shouldn't stop me from having another cupcake. So you explain yourself to me." So when we ask why in this way, we're putting someone to the test. We're doubting their goodness. We're undermining their authority. In effect, we're putting them on trial. And so as we look at what's different in this text this morning, It's who's testing whom. But to look at that, we do need to look at the things that are similar. And so once again, we see, as we saw in 15 and 16 of Exodus, we see how destructive grumbling can be. In verse 3, we read that the people grumbled against Moses. And they said, "Why do you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst." And I'm talking a lot about thirst this morning. I'm going to have a drink of water. The first thing that we notice here really is that grumbling it's contagious. Right? It spreads. It's not just one person who has a grumble. It runs through everyone. When the people arrive at Rephidim, it's understandable that they would be hot and thirsty. They're in a desert. Traveling through the desert is difficult work, and water is hard to find. But the whole point of God's testing in the previous 2 chapters was to demonstrate to his people that he's always with them, that he would provide for their every need. When they set out that morning, when they walked out, there was bread on the ground, manna from heaven. It was there because when God said he would provide it, he provided it every single day. They saw that morning that God was keeping his promises. And yet they arrive at this place and they're hot and they don't right away see where any water is and they start to grumble. All they needed to do was trust the Lord, to obey his word, but instead they grumble. They complain, they have a whinge. And we know how this goes. We all know how this goes. Somebody complains about how hot it is. And that sort of breaks the seal. And so someone else chimes in. And then that grumbling spreads, and it spreads, and it spreads. And as it spreads, it always escalates. It doesn't just stay at, yeah, it's really hot and I'm really thirsty. It's like, no, this is the worst place ever. We're going to die here and you don't even care. What started out as a group of people who were understandably thirsty, it very quickly dissolves into, why are you trying to kill us and our children? So when we engage in grumbling conversations, we amplify our own discontent. And we tend to reinforce one another's own worst instincts. It sort of becomes this feedback loop for sin. And so as a result, we generally get farther and farther away from any real solution. Because when we grumble, what we're usually doing is we're talking about the person with whom we have a complaint, rather than talking to the person with whom we have a complaint. And of course, ultimately, whenever we're dissatisfied in any situation, the person we really need to talk to is the Lord. The whole point of the previous tests was so that God's people would turn to him. Whenever we are dissatisfied, the one we need to turn to is the Lord, because he's the one who is truly and ultimately in control of our lives and in every circumstance. Now, over the last few months, I think maybe 3 months this was going on, Liz and I had been trying to come to an agreement with our landlord on agreeing to terms of a new lease. So our tenancy agreement runs out in February, and we've got to have something in place if we're going to stay there, or if we're going to have to find a new place to live. And so initially, our landlord he proposed a rent increase that it was just more than we could afford. So we presented a counter offer, and then we waited, and we waited, and we waited for him to reply. And so, of course, in the meantime, I started talking with estate agents, and I started looking at new apartments in case we did need to move. And you know what felt really good to me in those months of waiting? Grumbling about my landlord. Grumbling about how unreasonable he was being, why he was asking too much for the rent. If you gave me an opening, I could tell you all about how fair and reasonable Liz and I were being, and how wrong our landlord was. But did my grumbling actually do any good? No, right? It didn't change anything. And honestly, it didn't make me feel any better. It kind of felt better in the moment. But the more I grumbled, the more stressed I felt, the more uncertain I was about what was going to happen. And who is it that actually provides for me and my family? Is it my landlord? No, it's the Lord. But was I turning to him with honest and curious questions? Not as often as I should have. Instead, I was just letting my grumble grow and spread to anybody who would listen. I allowed my grumbling to amplify my own discontent, to amplify, honestly, my own distrust in the Lord. And yet the Lord is gracious. And so despite my grumbling, he's provided a fair agreement with our landlord. We don't have to move. We're going to get to stay in our apartment. We'll have a rent increase that we can live with. Because God takes care of us. And if he wanted us to move, that would have happened. But this brings us to another thing we need to understand about grumbling, and it's that it hardens our hearts. Right? The more we grumble, the further we get from the Lord, and the harder our hearts get. And so instead of asking honest and curious why questions of the Lord, grumbling puts him to the test. It questions his goodness. It accuses him of evil. Now, all of us face disappointment in our lives. Right? There are things that we deal with that are hard and are difficult, and we don't understand them. Why did I get passed over for a promotion at work? Why can't I find a house in the neighborhood I want to live in? Why am I still single? Why have all of my friends moved away? Why did my parents get divorced? Why did my friend have to die? Our lives are filled with occasions to ask God honest and unflinching why questions. The Psalms are full of them. Why, Lord? How long? There are things that happen in our lives that we don't understand. And God says, bring it. Bring those questions. But those kinds of questions are very different from questions like, why does God hate me? Why doesn't God want me to be happy? Why has God abandoned me? Why doesn't God care about what I want? Right? These are questions that are rooted in grumbling. They push the Lord away rather than drawing near to him. And ultimately, this grumbling hardens our hearts. Psalm 95 reflects on these very events. What happens in Exodus 17 is reflected in Psalm 95, and it says, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day of Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work." Right? They saw what God could do. They woke up that morning and saw what God would do. And yet they hardened their hearts. And then the writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 3, he picks up on this and says, "Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it's called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin." So the danger of grumbling is a hard heart. And so we need to think back to the very beginning of Exodus. What was the central theme for the story of the plagues? What was the thing that was going on with Pharaoh that we read again and again and again? That he had a hard heart. That he hardened his heart against the Lord. Right? The whole tension in that story is the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. And yet now, even after seeing all that God would do for his people, all that he has done for them, because of their grumbling, God's people, God's own people, who he's led through the Red Sea, who he's provided for in the desert, they're becoming like Pharaoh. Instead of cultivating their faith, instead of obeying God's commands, their grumbling is leading them to harden their hearts and to turn away from the Lord. Because more than anything else, grumbling puts God to the test. It puts him to the test by judging him. That's what we're doing when we grumble against God. We're judging God. We're saying, God, I don't really trust you to do what's best for me. I think I deserve better than what I've gotten. I think you've let me down. If I want something, why can't I have it? And who are you to tell me no? And so what does God do with us when we begin grumbling? When we become hard-hearted and unbelieving people? Does he pour out his wrath on us? Does he afflict us with plagues like he did to Pharaoh? No. When we become like Pharaoh in the hardness of our hearts, God also becomes like Pharaoh, but in a very different way. And so look with me at verses 5 and 6. The Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." So God tells Moses to go to this place, and he tells him to carry something with him. What does he take with him? His staff, right? The staff with which he struck the Nile, the staff that ushered in the plagues and brought destruction on Egypt, the staff of the Lord, the staff that brought judgment down. The staff that brought judgment down on Pharaoh. And what does God tell Moses to do with this staff? He says to strike the rock so that water will come out of it. And then here's the important point. Where's God when all of this happens, right? The complaint from the Israelites is that God is far away and he's not near and he hasn't kept his promise. But where is he? He says, I am standing on the rock. Right? So when the blow comes down on the rock, it comes down on God himself. God himself takes the blow of judgment, right? Judgment that was brought down on Pharaoh. Judgment is brought down on the Lord. The grumbling of the Hebrews, in effect, it puts God on trial. And so God stands there accused of trying to kill his people and their children. God's goodness is called into question. And so Moses is put in the middle to act as judge. And if we look at this honestly, we are assured that God is indeed good. He's provided again and again and again for his people. They've lacked nothing through this entire ordeal. God has spared them from plagues. He's delivered them from slavery. He's given them food and water in the desert. I mean, when he left Egypt, they took all of the Egyptians' gold and silver and jewelry with them. They're doing all right. It's clear that God is innocent, that he deserves to be vindicated. But Moses brings down the staff of judgment, and it lands on God himself. He takes the judgment that his people deserve, and because he does this, blessings flow out for his people. Now, if you've read the title of my sermon, then most of you have probably already worked out the reference. In their song, "You Can't Always Get What You Want," the Rolling Stones sing, and I'm not going to sing this time. But they sing that you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need. And so as God's people make their way through the desert, right, they lose sight of where they're going. And all they can see is what they don't have. And so grumbling clouds their vision. It blinds them to God's presence. It blinds them to God's goodness, and it begins to harden their hearts. They demand an answer from God. And he allows himself to be put in the place of judgment. And rather than vindicating himself and saying, "Look at all the stuff I've done," he takes the punishment for his people's sin. Now, he doesn't necessarily give them what they want, but he gives them exactly what they need. We read earlier in the service from 1 Corinthians 10 where Paul says that in the desert, God's people drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Right? So if there's any doubt, Paul makes that very clear for us. What happened at Massa and Meribah is a picture of what would happen to Jesus. At the cross, God himself would once again be put on trial. Sinful and rebellious people would shout out, "Crucify him." And the perfect, sinless Jesus would stand in silence, and he would take the judgment that his people deserve. And the staff of judgment would fall on him, and blessings would flow out for all of us. God understands that our lives are difficult. He knows that the good he has planned for us, it's not always going to line up with what we want our lives to look like. He isn't always going to give us what we want, but he will always meet our deepest need. And it won't be, as the Rolling Stones say, because we try sometimes. It's because of his mercy. We can trust in God's goodness because he stood on that rock. And he hasn't held anything back from us. He's given us his son. He's taken the blows of judgment that we deserve. He's given everything. And so when we're tempted to grumble, remember the rock in the desert. Remember the cross. When we give into that temptation and we have grumbling, hard, and unbelieving hearts, remember that rock in the desert and remember the cross. God has provided all we need, all we have ever needed, and all we ever will need. God has given us himself. Please pray with me.